Welcome to Care, where we have candid conversations about giving care and receiving care.
As experts in psychology, mind-body wellness, and caregiver well-being, we created a new genre of support for caregivers. We joined the caregiver team, providing individualized tools and resources to help caregivers transform their experience.
I'm Jackie, a licensed clinical psychologist and certified yoga instructor, passionate about providing holistic solutions to transform people's relationship to stress and overwhelm. I love supporting caregivers in navigating the complexities of their roles and returning to their priorities, especially returning to themselves.
And I'm Marcie, a licensed clinical psychologist and expert in neuropsychology, on a mission to help caregivers notice where they're stuck and work together with them to identify and build strategies to get unstuck. When I was suddenly diagnosed with breast cancer, a whole new perspective was introduced to caregiving care. From caregiver expert to care recipient, I found myself in a unique position to bridge the gap between the experience of providing care and receiving care.
Join us on a journey examining different caregiving topics and experiences in which we draw from both our professional expertise and now very personal experience. Full disclosure, caregiving struggles just got a lot more personal. Okay, so we are back with a Care episode. This is episode 5, and we're going to be talking about grief. And how this relates to caregiving, to being on the other side of that as a care recipient, and what it's like to kind of, building off of some of what we talked about in the normalcy episode, like when your plans change, how to deal with that and how that does bring up grief or even like visions for what your plans were for the future. So I think you already have some thoughts on it. So I'm gonna see what you've been thinking off the top of your head.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, I don't know that necessarily like grief is the first thing that pops into people's mind when they think of like a reaction to changing plans or changing circumstances or things like that. I think more often people think of grief like in the context of someone passing away or dying and like how you respond to events like that. Um, but grief really is just the emotional and psychological response to any kind of loss, but not just limited to a death. Obviously, it's relevant there too. And for me, like in my experience with breast cancer, um, just there was so much sudden change that I was facing. And grief is really like the emotion that came along with a lot of those change in plans and change in like thoughts of what the future might look like. And that was the case both for me and for my husband for sure. Um in a bunch of different areas, and it kind of like there was kind of like a scope of things, like from changing immediate plans to changing or having less certainty around more like long-term plans, like family and career and stuff like that.
Yeah. When you say family, do you mean like family planning, like thinking about that part of life?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like creating a family
Yeah. Yeah. And
or
like
building a family, yeah.
sure, like if that will happen or like if you'll continue that, if when, I mean, obviously, like both an if and a when it comes to that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and, like, from the immediate, like, will I even be here, right? Which, like, in the face of the immediate diagnosis was an unknown, and I mean, it's still an unknown, but the trajectory of things, as I move through my treatment and stuff like that, like, things are looking okay, and, like, starting to let myself think a little bit more about like, okay, well, like if I am able to reach remission and, all of that, like what would it look like? So it's like a constant evolution of like what ifs and like nervous about thinking about the future, but also like sort of feeling stuck if I'm not thinking about the future, things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I was going to ask you, like, if you felt like other people in your life, so like you as the person who has to change plans, right? And grieving that and like grieving the if and the when, like not knowing the answers to that. And I was going to ask you if other people in your life you feel like were experiencing grief too, like if they, I don't know, like I guess if their plans changed because of this too or something. And it sounds like the first place you can think of that happening very easily, right? Like is your relationship. So like your husband's grief around that. Is it something that as I mean, just from your personal experience, and I'd be curious like what your perspective is for other people. Do you feel like that's helpful to talk about or like to hear from him on? Like, would it be helpful to hear from somebody who's in that caregiving position about their grief experience, or would it feel more pressured? Or like, how does, I don't know if that's come up, but
Yeah. No, I think that so here's a kind of specific example just to like illustrate this. And this was more in the context of like immediate plans changing. So we had a couple trips planned for last winter and this spring that when I was diagnosed, we basically had to cancel everything. And so that included going back to Iowa for his grandparents' 65th wedding anniversary. We ended up missing that because it was like a week before my surgery and I just like couldn't risk getting sick. Um and then we were supposed to go to Mexico with a group of friends, his like brother and our sister-in-law and his two best friends from high school and their wives. We were also supposed to go to Chicago in there. But but particularly around the Iowa trip and the Mexico trip, I feel like we were both really sad to miss those. I mean, the Iowa trip was happening like so close to when I was diagnosed and when I had my surgery that we were just like completely overwhelmed by everything. I don't think we like thought about it that like as much, but like looking back, it's something that like of course we're disappointed that like we weren't able to be there to like celebrate that huge moment in his family. Um the Mexico trip, since that was like a couple months out, that was supposed to be in March, and our friends and everyone still went, which was great. But both of us felt like really sad about not being able to go. And he definitely expressed that to me, just like how, sad and like how much it sucked that like we weren't able to go. And it was interesting because for me at least, like that sort of was a mutual experience that we were both having. So in a way, it kind of like put us on the same page or bonded us together. Like, yes, I felt bad because it's my fault in a way, or like that was one of kind of like the narratives or thoughts that crossed my mind. Um, however, like I think the more powerful experience in all of that was us being on the same page that like we were both really disappointed we weren't able to do this thing together and to do it with our friends and like he ended up which I thought was really great he ended up still taking off a day of work not the whole week like he was going to
Mhm.
because he was like that's pointless but um but he ended up still taking off a day of work so that, like, he could still have, like, a mini vacation, and, like, we went to a Mexican restaurant in the
Mhm.
area, um, to, like, be in Mexico for a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not the same at all, but it was, like, a fun thing that we got to do together. We still got to create a memory together. We still got to enjoy good food together. And so yeah, I think that was a constructive way to kind of handle that for
Yeah.
us. Um but yeah, to circle back to your original question, since now I've rambled on, I think that it can, in some contexts, be helpful for the caregiver to express what they're feeling and to have an open and honest, conversation of that, or about that. Um, at least that was in this case.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense, and probably too because, like, he was aware of how you felt, right? So, like, there was a little bit more foundation laid for that to be kind of a clearly overlapping, like, shared experience, and I could see how your mind would go to that place too of, like, this is my fault, right? Even though it's not something you did, it's something that has happened to you, right? But still like that's going to cross your mind. And I think the way you're talking about getting support in that way was actually like it felt valid to express your emotions then around like, yeah, this like sucks, right? That like you could kind of be in the suck together for a while and experience that and then find some way basically to like honor that suck, right? Which maybe in a way of like, okay, so we're gonna go to a Mexican restaurant. Like, we know this isn't the same, but like, we're gonna do something that just kind of honors like the suck of this experience. Um, and I feel like it probably really depends, like in terms of when expressing your grief to the person that's like a part of the grief too, like when that's productive and helpful and when it's not. And, I'm thinking about like some of the caregivers we've worked with, or even like thinking about our parents. I mean, I don't think my mom would have been able to do that with my aging grandma right before she died, like
Mhm.
to express her grief around what was going on. Like it wouldn't have been understood in that way. This is a completely different scenario, right? Like those roles are still there, but still different. So I think sometimes experiencing grief can be such an isolating experience on either end of it too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that. That I think that there are situations that, like, it makes sense to share that grief and that can kind of lighten the burden. I think that there are situations that it doesn't make as much sense, and recognizing that, noticing that, and being able to get support elsewhere, because I think expression of the grief and disappointment is, for a caregiver, is important, even if it's not the care recipient that, you know, you're able to express it to.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'm sure you can think of a lot of times when like it would be nearly impossible to for like the caregiver to express it, right? I'm thinking about people who, if they're caring for someone with like a neurodegenerative disease or, someone who can't remember who they are all the time, right? Like that's not going to be something probably that comes up, or if it did, it would probably contribute to that sense of loneliness or isolation. Um, but yeah, like so then getting that support elsewhere, because I think expressing grief is like a critical component of processing what's going on. Like grief is weird because there's not necessarily something to do about it
Mhm.
except to be in it and to find someone who can essentially share in that experience with you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are, you know, obviously different intensities of grief for different experiences that we have. So, like, the grief around changing or not being able to go on a trip right, is clearly different than like grief around, potentially not being able to like build a family in the way that we had anticipated. Um, which is also clearly different than like grief around losing somebody.
Mhm.
So like I think that it's just important to acknowledge that like there are different intensities of grief probably, and also the same kind of stages that go into grieving can apply to lots of different situations or scenarios.
Yeah. What are the other things that have come up for you that like you've experienced intensity around when it comes to grief? Like, I don't know if it was like things that, had been engaging in, or if almost it was more about like feeling like you had more certainty, right? Whether or not that is true, but feeling like you had more certainty around your future plans right
Mhm.
before your diagnosis. Yeah, like where do you feel like grief shows up the most?
Yeah, I think it really has shown up the most for me in like how I envision my future and kind of like grieving the future that I thought I would have, both because now, right, like the future is uncertain no matter what. All we have is the present moment, and yet we spend so much of our time thinking about the future or
Mhm.
reflecting on the past. And I think that, like most people, I had kind of like an idea of what my future would look like. And when I was healthy, and same with my husband, when, he had an idea of what he thought our future would look like. And when you're healthy, like you kind of have the luxury, and I think I've maybe said this before, but you have the luxury of like pretending that
Mhm.
can be certain about the future and like what things are going to look like. Um and for me that's been like the biggest change. One of the biggest. It's been a big psychological change. Just like in terms of how I view the future, because it just feels everything just feels the reality of the uncertainty is much more significant
Yeah.
for me. Um, and so not even like grief around, not being able to do what I want to do or thought that I wanted to do in the future, but like just my whole way of thinking about the future completely shifted.
Yeah.
Um, and for me, big things that matter to me and that are important to me are family and work. And I think both of those areas have been kind of the biggest things where like I've felt loss or like change of expectations. Um and I think at least for the family side of things, my husband and I mean my parents too, it's been interesting their response to everything. Probably have feel that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Like you have experienced a complete shift in how what planning for the future looks like or doesn't look like now, having to be basically again, like there's always that uncertainty, right? But like it's a lot clearer. The uncertainty is a lot clearer now, right? It's almost like leading with the uncertainty. Like, I would like to do this in the future. I have no idea if that's, possible. That is very different than I'd like to do this in the future. So I'm setting myself up to do this. So I'm almost certainly going to do this, right? Like now it's a little bit more like, don't know, you've also experienced something, right? That's like so destabilizing and jarring that you didn't predict would happen, that, it kind of is that experience of like you're living in that full uncertainty.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's weird and interesting to me at the same time that, like, right, being in the present moment, like, nothing gets you really into the present moment like illness or or, like, a major stressor, and also, though, it can make your life feel, like, a little bit little, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, kinda
Yeah.
narrows things down.
Yeah. How, like, what do you think about keeping life big? Whether it's like, I guess, like, how are you doing that? Which, I mean, knowing you personally, like, I know some of the ways that you're doing that, but, guess sharing that, like, how do you keep your life big when you feel like it's narrowing? And also, like, what are your observations maybe of like your husband, right? Like, just thinking about from a caregiver's perspective, like, how did they keep their life big when it feels like it's narrowing? Because I would say that actually is probably such a big thing that we've heard from people that we've worked with and helped. Also our own parents. I mean, certainly when I think about like my mom caregiving for my grandma, again, like completely different situation than you're in, of course, but like how that narrowed her life, how that limited her flexibility and options. Um, and same with mindset, right? Because like always having to think of this other layer of things in a different way. And then the uncertainty too of like, well, I got to be prepared for this trip not working out the way I thought because what if?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a learning process, and I think that I'm still on that journey of learning how to keep my life, feeling big. Um, and I think that, my husband and my parents are as well. I think that in response to my diagnosis, are all of our kind of immediate responses were like, quit everything and just like laser focus in on like this diagnosis. But, and while that I think is adaptive and useful in the short term, like, to try to figure things out, in the long term, like that wasn't going to be sustainable. So, for my parents, for example, like they had a trip planned for February that like I was diagnosed in October. They had a trip planned for February. Like initially they were going to cancel it and then like ultimately decided to keep it, and we saw like how my response to chemotherapy was going, and it turned out that it was on like an alternate week of when I was getting chemo, and so like I usually felt pretty okay. And so they decided to, it was up until like a week before my mom was still like going back and forth of like, well, should we cancel it? Should we not? And like ultimately they decided to go. And I think that was really important for them to do. I think, you know, my husband, and we've talked about this a little bit, like maintaining a routine of self care and like letting himself do the bike or go hit golf balls or go to the gym, like whatever, play a video game, whatever it is, to continue taking care of himself, like in a way that was completely separate from taking care of me or taking care of our son. Um, I think that as time goes on, all of us have been able to kind of like loosen our grips around the like immediate fear of what came with my diagnosis. And for me, I've like really what I've started to do, although it's not perfect, um, is giving myself permission to think about the future knowing it is uncertain.
Mhm.
So, if it's, thinking about the future in a way that serves me, right? Like, imagining how I might build a family or what I might do in work in a way that's like not going to, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I'm trying to strike a balance between being here and now and not overcommitting myself or overextending myself because I really do have to prioritize my health. And also giving myself permission to think about the future because it's uncertain for everybody. And to think
Yeah.
about the future without immediately saying like, oh, I hope that, I hope one day I'm able to like build my private practice bigger
Mhm.
without the immediate follow-up of like, "Oh, but, like, who knows?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you have cancer." So,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
So like allowing yourself to go there, that alone is like, that's like, it sounds like that's something that you're practicing basically, like you said, like it's not even the automatic. It's funny, right? Because like it used to be the automatic diagnosis happened, and the automatic became more like talking yourself out of being able to go there and to plan for the future. And this is kind of like you're really living in reality probably a lot more clearly than many of us, right? Because it's like there's an acceptance of the level of uncertainty, or maybe that's part of the practice. I think it's hard to accept something like that for all of us, right? And to allow yourself anyway, though, to dream up your future and to think about those things. And I feel like that's, I mean, I feel like that's really important no matter what. Like it, I think it's important for our mind and body and spirit to like be able to go to those places, right, where we're dreaming and we're kind of engaging in really like intentional mind wandering of like, planning too, right? Of like, what could this look like, and imagining it. My cat's walking around and participating in this conversation as well.
yes. Our favorite featured guest.
It's so funny. But yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, it's an interesting point too, because like I think for some caregivers, maybe most times for caregivers, that would be really relevant. Like to allow yourself to go there, right? To go to that place, which is probably hard for some caregivers who have been in that role for so long that their life has gotten smaller or has been restricted in these ways, that it's like it's been so long since they've dreamt up what the future could be.
Yeah, and I think actually, like, making plans, which, like I said, when I was first diagnosed, like, we canceled everything, and then slowly over time, we've started scheduling things knowing that, like, I'm not out of the woods. Also, I still have, like I'm almost done chemotherapy, but I still have multiple steps left in my treatment. And like kind of what we've decided to do is to plan things anyway, get things scheduled, knowing that like we may have to cancel them and that's okay. Like it may not work out the way we plan and that's okay, but having that something to look forward to serves us.
Yeah.
And so putting things on the calendar, being hopeful, right? Like that gives us hope for
Yeah.
the future because if otherwise, like, of course, enjoying the moment that you're in is extremely important. And like, there's always, I think, for me, there's always trying to find this balance of like being in the present moment and also setting up your future present moments.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
both of those things are important.
Yeah, and I think what you said about hope is so like on point. I think people really underestimate the power of hope and the power of like being hopeful, right? I think it's easy to feel like, yeah, but reality right now is this thing, or like, yeah, but we don't know, right? Because all of that's true too, but hope is really powerful, and it just like opens a little bit of a window and a little bit of softness to exploring possibilities, or like you said, like, okay, so we are making plans, we're setting up these possibilities for the future. And the softness is also, if we need to change it, we change it, right? I mean, now you certainly have experience changing this, just like other caregivers have a lot of experience, right? Like having to be flexible with their plans, even when they really don't want to be at all, right? I mean, that's very much in your wheelhouse to, like, the cliche, right? Cross that bridge when you get there. Like you've been doing that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that it's kind of like across the board, even for like extended family members. Oh,
It's a very big yawn with those.
was I boring you,
She's
Dom?
really a part of this right now.
That was
I
let's
liked
chat
that.
now. Um, but I think like, and I don't know why trips are like, I think because like people plan
Yeah,
trips
yeah.
well in advance. That's why they like keep coming into my mind. But like my family has a big trip planned for June. And it was like the same thing when I was first diagnosed. We were kind of like, okay, well, let's like see how things go. And then like after my first round of chemotherapy, my dad was kind of like, okay, we're canceling the trip. Like, if you can't go, none of us are going. And then like after like 3 rounds of chemotherapy, when I had kind of like seen how things were going, I was like, well, maybe let's not cancel the trip so
Mhm.
that like we have something to look forward to. So
Yeah.
we kept the trip. And then I ended up in the hospital, which was going to delay my chemo. And my dad was like, okay, well, maybe we should cancel the trip. Or he was like, I think we can afford 1 or 2 more delays, and otherwise we have to cancel the trip. And it's just been this like, you know, very much like we have this thing that we're all looking forward to, and also like having some softness around like we may have to change this, and making modifications in advance to sort of set ourselves up
Mhm.
to be more okay. Of course, we're going to be disappointed and there will be some grief around it, but to be more okay um in the event that we do need to pivot. So
Yeah.
like for the trip with my family, what that looked like was like getting insurances that like
Mhm.
you may not otherwise typically get.
Mhm.
Um for me and my husband in terms of making plans for the summer, like planning trips closer to home
Yeah.
rather and smaller trips rather than, you know, bigger trips that we had maybe initially had envisioned for this summer. And like with friends too, like we decided, a group of my friends, like my two best friends from high school, um, and their families, we all were planning to go to a beach a couple hours from this area in August. And then ultimately we decided like let's all do a staycation because I'm not sure when radiation is going to start for
Mhm.
me. And they were kind of like, let's just do a staycation in Baltimore so then like we know we can all be there.
Yeah. 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 So it's like, how do we do this thing that we're looking forward to it, but alter it so that it is more of a sure thing, right? Like reducing uncertainty where you can, and then knowing that, like, sure, there's going to be a level of that surrounding it. But I mean, that's a great idea too, right? Like setting yourself up for modifying as you need to, which doesn't mean like you feel nothing about having to modify something or change it, but it does set you up for a little bit more ease with that.
Of course, without totally eliminating, right? Like the extreme would be just don't plan anything.
Yeah.
So how do you still like plan for a future even though like the uncertainty is so front and center?
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. And like you said, I mean, the real truth is that, like, we're all planning for a future that we don't know exists, right? Like, and we don't know what might come up along the way, and that we might have to change things. This is like, again, putting that more front and center. And I think acknowledging the grief and talking about the grief is really important. And I mean, I think that you named things that would be relevant for caregivers too, for sure to be thinking about. And like also getting back to that idea of like noticing when your life gets restricted, which in your case, right, that could look like, okay, no plans, we're taking plans off the table, right? So how to make it bigger? Well, identifying some things to look forward to and allowing that to be there, and then allowing there to be space to modify it too.
Mhm. Yeah.
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 Good. Well, I think this was a good conversation. I'm glad that we had it, and we'll definitely keep going with care to care and see what else we have to say about things.
Sounds great. Please like and subscribe and follow our channel, and we'll be back with another episode soon.
Sounds good.